Start your day with It's the Business. Here's Phil Dobbie.
Well, some astonishing news for you to start off with today. You'll be very surprised to learn that Brexit isn't working out so well after all.
But it's not just teething problems. There is going to be a permanent cost to doing business with Europe, by simple down to the fact that you have to pay money every time you do a customs declaration. That's a permanent hit on the economy, and the cost of that to the UK public has been estimated in the billions.
That's Professor Alex de Ruyter from the Centre for Brexit Studies at Birmingham University. I ask him today, who wins from Brexit?
The only people who could see Brexit as a benefit would be those of the persuasion who thought that the European regulatory framework was too onerous and that we wanted to have more free market shift in this country.
We will particularly look at the impact that Brexit is having on trade between the UK and, well, the UK. What does it mean for the internal market? What does it mean for Northern Ireland? Plus, schools are going back today. What's the impact of that? And Rishi Sunak, he might be worried about debt. Well, he should take a look at what this guy's doing.
It obviously wasn't easy. It wasn't always pretty, but it was so desperately needed.
And in other news of world-shattering importance, spoiler alert, it's a girl. It's Monday, the 8th of March. Who cares? It's Monday, the 8th of March, 2021. Good morning.
And now, it's The Business, making sense of it all with Phil Dobbie.
Well, I'm looking at a report on Brexit from the FT on Friday saying French exports to the UK were down 13% in January compared to the average of the previous 6 months, with French imports from the UK falling 20%. This is according to details published on Friday by French Customs, who also said in a statement trade from Britain is disrupted due to Brexit. Well, it can't be COVID, because this is 20% down on the previous 6 months when COVID was ravaging the nation and the world. But it's not just this trade with the EU that's the problem. There's also the question of what Brexit is doing for our trade with the UK, between the UK and the UK, with those custom checks over the Irish Sea for goods from the British mainland to Northern Ireland, which is, of course, just simply a different part of the UK. Now, we want to extend the grace period on border checks for those goods. So we've got problems now, but we haven't even introduced those border checks yet. We want to extend the grace period. This has always been a sticking point in the whole Brexit process, and it wasn't resolved with the deal we supposedly struck, and the EU now isn't keen on extending the grace period. Lord Frost, writing in the Sunday Telegraph, said yesterday it was necessary because of the fragile situation in Northern Ireland. He said, without this threat of disruption from the EU, who are threatening legal action, so of course it's all the EU's fault, without this threat of disruption, we can continue our discussions, he says, with the EU to resolve difficulties arising from the Northern Ireland Protocol. We can reach those, that we can do that all constructively, he says. Obviously, to arrive at the magic answer that has evaded us since the vote in 2016. We've only had almost 5 years to work this out. What do we do about the Irish border? Well, we'll be looking at what's going wrong with Alex de Ruyter from the Centre for Brexit Studies. We'll do that soon on It's the Business. Now, if you are American and earn less than $80,000 a year, you're going to be getting a check for $1,400 later this month. If you're a couple, that's $2,800. I'm so good at the math. It's as good as written into law. The Senate was the only obstacle, and after 24 hours of wrangling over the precise detail, they have agreed to spend another $1.9 trillion. That is $1.9 million. I think that's right, isn't it? Yeah, $1.9 million on the pandemic relief package. That's as well as $300 per week as a boost to the jobless. Currently, it's $400 per week, but it's now $300, and it's going to continue until September the 6th. And it will pass into law this week. It just now needs the approval of the modifications in the Congress, which is a Democratic majority. So they are there, and Joe Biden is more than a little chuffed.
I want to start off by thanking the Vice President, but I want to thank all of the senators who worked so hard to reach a compromise, to do the right thing for the American people during this crisis, and voted to pass the American Rescue Plan. It obviously wasn't easy. It wasn't always pretty, but it was so desperately needed.
But what will all this extra money do to inflation? There's two schools of thought on this. One is that all this extra money will cause inflation. The other one is, strangely enough, that it won't. So who's right on this? Well, we've already seen a response in bond yields in America with the expectation that this was going to happen. We've seen them rise. They're up to 1.6% on Friday. To give you some context, they were 0.5% in August last year. So does this mean that interest rates could be just around the corner? If you've got rising bond yields, that tends to be what happens, not just in the United States, but around the world. So think about this before you buy your next McMansion. Is an interest rate rise, maybe not in the next few months, but in the next year? We'll look at what all this means in Wednesday's edition of the podcast. It's also going to be very interesting to see how well this works, this idea of a direct injection of cash into someone's bank account. Does that really help to boost spending in the short term? How good is it for the economy? Something else we can explore this week on the podcast as well. Now, if inflation doesn't come from the US stimulus, maybe it's going to come from oil prices, which are now over $70. Remember last year when they were actually negative, when we had too much oil, so much so that there was nowhere to store it and they had to pay people to take it away. Now, we've been hearing this morning of a drone attack on a refinery in Saudi Arabia, which is causing concerns about supply. So Brent crude is up almost 3%. It was up quite a lot anyway last week because OPEC Plus was saying that they weren't going to stop the limits on production. They weren't going to increase production, in other words. It's about $71 now. It started this year about $50. So oil is on the rise, and of course oil does have a big influence on inflation because so much of what we use is dependent on oil. So add that to the mix of concerns that prices might be going up. All makes the 1% pay increase for nurses all that more insulting, doesn't it? Also today, Starling Bank is set to raise another £270 million from investors. Sky News was reporting this last night, which means it's going to be worth more than £1 billion. Doesn't that make it a unicorn? It does seem to be doing rather well. They seem to be raising money to expand, not to cover problems in the business, whereas others like Monzo, another of these startup banks that's driven by a mobile phone app, they're not doing so well. They had a round of funding last year which saw the value of the company discounted 40% on its previous funding round. So certainly heading in the wrong direction. I hope they don't collapse because I've actually got some money sitting in my Monzo account. Not much, admittedly, but, enough to keep the kids in Special K. I'd hate to see them go hungry. And, although it could save a bit of money. And in the other newspapers today, and it's International Women's Day today. Not much in the papers here about that, but the West Australian. This is, a real Murdoch rag showing its true colours. The headline on the West Australian: man-hating New Age feminists who have free reign. Thanks, mate. Oh, and happy International Women's Day, says the West Australian. I don't know who is the editor of the West Australian, but I'm imagining some pale, overweight, middle-aged man with ideas lodged firmly in the 1950s. Man-hating New Age feminists who have free reign. And a photograph of 8 of these supposedly man-hating New Age. I wonder if they know that they hate men. Anyway, that's the front page of the West Australian. You read through it all, it seems like it's a bit of a vendetta against someone who said something bad about the West Australian. So it's also a very thin-skinned, middle-aged white man who's running that thing. Now, I kind of hope it's not a woman. Who's the editor? Now, the other big news this is for International Women's Day, the big front page cover on most of the newspapers here in the UK is all about this.
3 days before our wedding, we got married. No one knows that, but we called the Archbishop and we just said, look, this spectacle is for the world.
Yeah, I think that gives you enough, doesn't it? This is going to be all over the media today, and that was enough for me. I don't need to see any more than, what was that, 2 seconds or 3 seconds. That's all I need to see of that interview. Thank you very much. But it is going to be all over the electronic media today. So best stick with us, really, for the next 15 or 20 minutes or so. Look, because we're going to talk about Brexit. Oh, joy. In the middle of last week, the UK government said it would unilaterally extend the grace period for food imports into Northern Ireland from the British mainland by 6 months. They had been trying to negotiate with Brussels for a 2-year extension, but the EU were having none of it. Now, this unilateral decision has the EU threatening legal action because they say it's a breach of the Northern Ireland Protocol. So, of course, so far, supermarkets have had this 3-month grace period to get their systems in place. But obviously, we're just a few weeks away from the end of that, hence the decision by the UK to extend it. But we're wanting to extend it by 2 years. I wonder whether that is because ultimately we know it's unworkable, that shipping food to Northern Ireland means crossing a sea of red tape, the Irish Sea of red tape. Well, Professor Alex de Ruyter is Director for the Centre for Brexit Studies at Birmingham City University. He's originally an Aussie, but he's lived here for a bit now, and he joins us. Is there actually an answer to this Irish border question, do you think?
Well, look, Phil, thanks for inviting me. I mean, there is no simple answer. I mean, that the Northern Ireland Protocol is the least messy option that we have. Yeah, and that's for the simple reason that because the Northern Ireland shares the obvious land border with the Republic of Ireland, which is part of the EU, there has to be some way of policing goods coming into Northern Ireland that could go onwards to the Republic of Ireland in terms of adhering to single market standards, because Northern Ireland, to all intents and purposes, stays as part of the single market and the EU customs union. So some form of checking needs to be put in place.
So can it be fixed with technology? Can we get it so that it operates? I mean, why this reason for a delay? Why can we not? Why after a few months have we not been able to get it working properly?
In terms of overcoming hurdles, for example, some can be smoothed with a combination of experience. I mean, if you've not been used to dealing with customs declaration procedures before, simply by dint of doing it, you're learning by doing. So we could expect that on the part of businesses, hauliers and logistics firms. But of course, the UK government also needs to provide better customs infrastructure, and that's true of the wider UK as well. But it's been quite...
infrastructure of the ports, you mean?
Yeah, in terms of the ports of entry and so on, in terms of physical and digital infrastructure. I mean, the UK government appears to have been quite tardy in putting the necessary customs facilitation in place.
All your size is saying it all. It's like, this is all very hard, and I think that's the attitude of a lot of people, isn't it? It probably is the attitude of the supermarkets, for example, are saying, well, okay, this is too hard. We're going to stick our warehouses in the Irish Republic, rather than trying to ship stuff over the Irish Sea, which is tragic, isn't it, for UK businesses to say, well, okay. We're actually going to give more business to the EU now, even to service our own domestic markets.
Yep, because the cost of customs declarations, I mean, they've been calculated on average to be about £35 per consignment. And when I say consignment, I mean an individual product. So you can see for supermarkets in particular, shipping food items across the Irish Sea, if a typical truck had hundreds of different products on it and they had to fill out a customs declaration for each individual product, then the cost of that soon become prohibitive. So they've had to change their business models, basically. And I mean, that is tragic for UK jobs and investment, because you're not just seeing it with the Republic of Ireland, you're also seeing it with other UK-based companies having to open up operations in mainland Europe because of trying to get around these customs hurdles, and that's going to cost jobs in this country. It already is.
So we've shot ourselves in the foot on this, then, haven't we? I mean, is there any upside? I mean, one of the upsides, obviously, for those people who didn't want to see too many people coming over from the continent working here and stealing our jobs, which was one of the arguments that was given, they've won. But I mean, is there any economic upside from all of this for the UK?
No. Sorry, I mean, that's a bit blunt, isn't it? Look,
well, okay, we'll be devil's advocate. Look, you and I didn't know what position we each took on this. We've all jumped on the same side, clearly, but maybe that's because we're arguing logic. But I mean, let's be devil's advocate. What could be a benefit? I mean, let's give it some time. All these border issues have been resolved. How could Britain come out of this?
Well, you say all these border issues can be resolved, and yes, they can. I mean, but it's not just teething problems. There is going to be a permanent cost to doing business with Europe by simple dint to the fact that you have to pay money every time you do a customs declaration. That's a permanent hit on the economy, and the cost of that to the UK public has been estimated in the billions, so there's a permanent hit. Is there an upside to Brexit? Well, I suppose it depends how you look at it. I mean, economically, even the UK government's own analysis suggests that a free trade agreement with the United States, for example, would only add about 0.16% onto UK GDP over the long term. And the same analysis has said that Johnson's trade deal, the sort we have now, a limited free trade agreement, will cost us about 5% of our GDP relative to where we could have been. So that there's no net economic benefit in any of these trade deals that the government likes to trumpet it's achieving or is going to achieve, should it actually achieve any of them. The only people who could see Brexit as a benefit would be those of the persuasion who thought that the European regulatory framework was too onerous and that we wanted to have more free market shift in this country because we didn't like Brussels' insistence on labour standards or environmental standards or consumer protection laws, product labelling and all the rest. They see that as getting in the way of the market. Now, that's the Brexit utopia that certain elements in Johnson's government like to believe. You only have to look at people like Dominic Raab or Jacob Rees-Mogg or Priti Patel or the current business secretary Kwasi Kwarteng. Raab, Kwarteng, Skidmore, Patel, and Liz Truss, the trade secretary, wrote a book, if I can use the phrase, back in 2012 called, Britannia Unchained. And essentially the premise of that is, if we free ourselves of the shackles of Brussels red tape, we can be like Singapore and the Thames. Suffice to say, it's just a fantasy. Because you look at the actual trade agreement that we have in place, it does have some pretty stringent measures in place to ensure that the UK maintains broad parity in regulatory standards in those areas that will affect trade and investment with the EU.
And look, Singapore does well because it has low corporate tax, and we just announced we're going to push corporate tax up to 25%. So we're going in the opposite direction from that. But and actually, that whole corporate tax thing, the one positive I could see for Northern Ireland would be that maybe companies could say, well, hey, look, we could be within the UK and let's set ourselves up in Northern Ireland so we can export to the EU with no controls. We can just roll trucks over the Irish border. But of course, now you look at it and say, well, hang on, why would you do that? Because the corporate tax in Ireland is 12.5%. Rishi Sunak just announced it's going to be 25% here. So there's absolutely no reason to set up a company in Northern Ireland, is there?
No, not from that perspective. No, I mean, if you're concerned by company tax rates, then Ireland looks a very attractive proposition. But of course, Ireland is an attractive proposition and has been for US multinationals, for example, because it had a relatively low-wage English-speaking workforce. It was in the single markets, it's in the EU, so it provided a ready platform there, and they all spoke English. So, the detractors of the Republic describe it as, Europe's tax haven, for example. So there is an element of that. I mean, in theory, NI could benefit of having the best of both worlds in terms of, if the UK arguably managed to negotiate a trade agreement with the United States, in theory, NI could benefit from lower tariffs for exporting there, but it would still have the benefits of being part of the single market and within the EU customs zone. So there is a case to be made that NI could enjoy the best of both worlds, but notwithstanding the practical difficulties that we see at the moment. But
that would create more problems as well, wouldn't it? Because the EU wouldn't like that very much if they had that porous border between Northern Ireland and Ireland, and there was a free trade agreement sitting with the US. Well, certainly they wouldn't want to see goods coming from the US into Northern Ireland then shipped onto the EU mainland, would they? So I mean, there's another area which we haven't faced as a problem yet, which could potentially be another sticking point.
Yeah, I mean, the situation in Northern Ireland, economically speaking, boils down to one thing, and that's the EU's, obvious and from its perspective, valid desire to maintain the integrity of the single market. I mean, fundamentally, that's what the Northern Ireland Protocol is designed to try and do. Now, I mean, my understanding is that the two sides are on the verge of agreeing an extension to the period of phasing in of these full checks. But I think another element to consider here, of course, is the political optics. Look at the loyalist community in Northern Ireland. I mean, we've recently seen announcements by those representing the paramilitary brigades that they are temporarily, renouncing their support for the Good Friday Agreement. Now, the protocol clearly violates the Good Friday Agreement because it creates a barrier between East and West, across the Irish Sea. So they're right when they say that. And for the UK government, of course, the last thing you want is elements amongst loyalist paramilitaries renouncing peaceful protests. I mean,
well, we're already hearing, aren't we, threats of violence to people at ports in Northern Ireland. So we've just moved the potential violence from the Northern Ireland border to the sea border, basically.
Yes, essentially that's correct. The nightmare scenario is that elements within the loyalist paramilitary groups take it on themselves to, I don't know, blow up customs infrastructure, for example. I mean, and I don't think it's too far-fetched to say that, this scenario is always there. So for the UK government, whatever its motives in doing this, there's a clear political optic there in in demonstrating to the unionist community that it will aggressively act to defend their interests as part of the union.
So then we've got the politics with the EU, of course, as well. I mean, we've already had them once. I mean, admittedly temporarily, and they said it was a mistake. I'm not quite sure how you can make a mistake like this, but revoking Article 16. Obviously, it's in the EU's interest to show that the relationship is problematic because they want a way of holding the EU together and make sure other people don't follow. So will we see, as a result of that, this political situation is going to remain troubled for some time with the EU? I mean, even if we get border checks sorted out and things are running smoothly, are we still going to have a more tense relationship with the EU? No, not that I suggest it was ever that great. Perhaps perhaps the UK was always a bit of an outsider in the EU anyway, even when it was in the club.
Oh, look, I think from the perspective of from my perspective, in a sense, Brexit is the gift that keeps on giving. I mean, the government can roll it out as a stick to beat the opposition on the head with, in the lead up to the next election. I mean, when one looks at the UK government's public utterances towards Europe, one has to view it in terms of who are they trying to appease. I mean, you look at their own voter base. Older, strongly anti-EU in their sentiments, that they and fed the nonsense by the right-wing press that it's some incipient super state, menacing, plucky little Britain. This is the backdrop to which these utterances are formed in, and the voter base for the Conservative Party nowadays is so anti-EU and pro-Brexit that it would be quite prepared to see Scotland separate from the UK and Northern Ireland reunify with the South. There are polls out there that significantly attest to that.
Right.
That's the
but part of that
backdrop.
sounds okay to me. I mean, the idea actually of a unified Ireland, to me, I mean, apologies to people listening in Northern Ireland who would be very against this, but I mean, looking at it from the outside, a united island of Ireland seems like that would be a good result. Not so keen on the idea that Scotland drifts off on its own, but I mean, and that would be an elegant answer, obviously, wouldn't it, to the Northern Ireland border issue if we actually just had a united Ireland.
When you look at it economically, I mean, certainly the current situation has done more to promote the cause of a reunified Ireland than 100 years of Sinn Féin. I think in that sense, if you're looking at the perspective of the Republican community who want to unify with the South, Boris Johnson has done them a big favour in agreeing to a withdrawal agreement that puts a barrier down the Irish Sea, because it further fuels the notion of an all-island economy.
So do you think, with Scotland, though, do you think that is a real possibility that Scotland will now use? Because I mean, the Scottish argument, obviously, and I worry of getting into this because I know this is a completely different conversation because all the questions around whether they can survive on their own. But do you think that the idea of an independent Scotland, where you then have the same border issue, don't you? Only all the goods from Scotland, if they want to go into the EU, unless they're flown out, are going to have to travel through England to get there. I mean, that is the border issue multiplied by 10, isn't it?
Yeah, you're absolutely spot on there. I mean, economically, it would have that kind of impact, and it would, if Scotland, if an independent Scotland were to rejoin the EU, you would get a hard barrier in place across the M74. What are the chances? Well, you'd have to. It's as simple as that. I mean, you would have checkpoints put in place. Assuming a remnant England and Wales chose to continue staying out of the single market. But of course, what are the prospects of that happening? Polls currently suggest that a majority of Scots favour independence. But the current furore over sturgeon versus salmon notwithstanding, or whether that will have any impact on SNP support, I'm not sure that it will. I still expect them to be returned with a working majority in the May elections in Holyrood. But
it seems unlikely, doesn't it? But then even though the voters are supporting the idea, you'd say, well, okay, it seems unlikely, but we thought that Brexit was unlikely as well. Yeah, these things have shown that they can happen.
Yeah, that's very true. But of course, with Scottish independence, saying that the Scottish Parliament can legislate to have an independence referendum, but in order for it to be legally binding, it would have to be approved by Westminster. The stance of the Johnson government at the moment is that it would oppose this, and it would use parliamentary means to oppose it, so that any consequent referendum would be non-binding. Now, what the standing of that would have, in a situation whereby I use the word unionist again in the same context, or in the Scottish, where unionists boycotted such a vote, how much legitimacy would it have? I mean, all these things are open to question, but it is possible that, I think it's highly likely that the SNP will be returned with a majority in that parliament. I mean, I think, the furor over whether Sturgeon knew or what she didn't know about salmon, when you look at her day-to-day handling of COVID-19 and the fact that it doesn't, seem to rate highly in the eyes of the Scottish public, to me would suggest that she will probably survive that and that they will go on. Anyway, I realise I'm drifting off topic here, but
well, you're enjoying it. You're enjoying drifting off. That's the important thing.
I think there's every likelihood that we'll see an independence referendum, but whether it has the support of Westminster remains to be seen.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Well, to finish off, I mean, we've only really talked about border issues. I mean, there's so much more. There's all the stuff around fishing quotas. There's the financial services issue. There's all those issues around passporting and this dispute over clearing of the euro in the City of London with the EU trying to grab hold of that. Is this stuff actively being discussed behind the scenes? Because we saw people jumping on planes and trains to Brussels almost every day up to the December the 31st deadline. There's no press coverage now. Does that mean there's no discussion going on? Are these things just are the cans being kicked down the road without any active discussion? Or are we trying to fix these problems?
Well, I mean, we will have to return to the negotiating table, obviously, when it comes to fishing. That was a kick the can down the road one. But, there will be other areas which will require ongoing conversations around for argument's sake, areas related to what were formerly shared regulatory spaces in the form of aviation. Financial services is a big one, of course, but I mean that's not in the gift of the UK government to have any influence over. I mean that's a decision that the EU will unilaterally make over whether to grant full equivalence to financial services firms. That the signs at the moment are looking increasingly bleak in that regard, and I think that comes back to your key point from the EU's perspective that there has to be seen to be a political cost to the UK for Brexit. Barnier has said as much, for example, and not granting them full equivalence in financial services may be one area. Now, look, fishing versus financial services, this is where the stance of the UK government has become something of a symbolic joke because it claimed to go to the wall for a fishing industry that represents less than, I think, 0.1% of UK GDP. Now, the agreement that it's reached for fishing has left a lot of fishermen high and dry. The shellfish market from Scotland is on the verge of collapsing. Whereas financial services with about 10% of UK GDP, employing a lot of high paid people in London and elsewhere, has sort of been left out in the cold.
So we're going to become a more protectionist nation as a result of all of this. I mean, we talked about global Britain. Are we going to actually have the reverse? I'm not saying that's necessarily a bad thing, but are we going to consume more? Are we going to eat that shellfish ourselves, for example? Are we going to change our taste in fish and start eating the fish that we actually catch in our waters rather than shipping them overseas and taking cod that's largely shipped in from elsewhere? And are we going to set up industries that are, primarily for the domestic market? Are we going to find that we are more insular looking? And protectionism, I mean, it depends on where you sit economically, but I mean, it's in some quarters, it's becoming fashionable again.
When we looked at this in terms of what the trajectory of the UK may well be like going forward, two scenarios were presented. One, that it would have to become more state interventionist. The other was that it would, try and go down the sort of free market route. That the trade agreement that we have in place with the EU sort of acts as a brake against both of those possibilities. We're committing ourselves to maintaining broad regulatory parity in areas concerning trade and investment. That acceptance of that, of course, also meant signing up to strict state aid provisions in the withdrawal agreement that would, appear to rule out overt subsidies of businesses for purely just subsidising business.
Which is a bit rich, actually, isn't it? Because the EU does allow an enormous amount of subsidies within.
Oh, look, I mean, the agreement contains tens of pages over to what circumstances subsidies and tax breaks that are allowed, but they're very tightly defined. I actually think it's a bit of a myth that EU state aid provisions were a reason that we should have left. I mean, there was a lot more that the government could do under them, but what I'm saying here essentially is that the road we can travel down is a bit limited, if we wish to keep that agreement in place. So I don't see the UK turning into a free market utopia, no. And the government will have to intervene more aggressively in certain sectors to the extent that agreement allows it. what was your comment around fishing? Or will we?
No, it's just no. But my point was, are we going to become a more international outlook? Are we going to be trading more, or are we just going to become more protectionist? Are we going to consume more of what we produce, whether it is fish or whether we're making our own cars or our own vacuum cleaners? Given that Dyson's now headed overseas, I mean, are we going to find? I mean, because that could be a good ending. If we find that more manufacturing, a bit like Donald Trump was trying to bring manufacturing back home. Maybe
he largely failed in that regard.
Of course he did, absolutely. But the idea was there. If that was the result of Brexit, that might be a positive. And my point was, if you believe protectionism is a good thing.
Yeah, well, I don't believe protectionism is a good thing. I think at the end of the day, free trade is better. But there have to be caveats, and that obviously for labour standards, environmental standards, and so on. Do I think we'll become more protectionist? I think the UK or England in particular will become more inward-looking, which is a great tragedy for the young in particular, because they've had the right to live, work and study in Europe just taken away from them. And I think the UK will be poorer as a result. You've hit to the heart of the matter here that if we were going to be more protectionist and produce more locally, we would need more national industry champions in order to do that. And then it's one of those perverse ironies of Brexit that Dyson and Bamford with JCB, are investing outside of this country. In the case of Bamford in France, and Dyson, of course, going to Singapore. They're just the cold-blooded rules of global capitalism. Multinational firms, wherever they were originally from, will go to places where the regulatory framework tends to be minimally disruptive to them, and that was the great strength of the single market. It created a block of 500 million people which all abided by the same standards and had no internal barriers.
Well, look, it's a grim picture we're painting, isn't it? Let's hope we muddle through somehow. Let's hope the economic hit isn't so great. And let's hope we do manage to streamline those borders at the very least. I mean, I guess if we look at tariffs, I mean, the percentage of tariffs these days is a lot less than it used to be. So perhaps it's not such a insurmountable problem. You'll notice here, Alex, I'm actually trying to find a positive to end on, because I don't want everyone to be thoroughly depressed at the end. But maybe the tariff issue is overplayed a little bit, and obviously as well, the currency fluctuations have a part to play here as well. So if we've got a weaker pound as a result of all of this, then okay, that's not so great for us trying to it works one way better than the other, doesn't it? Really, I guess there's pros and cons of that too.
Well, I mean the issue about the pound, I mean, it devalued by about 20% after the 2016 referendum result, and there was no evidence to suggest that exports grew as a result. None at all. In terms of, look, I mean, the sun will go on shining. I mean, the UK is still the fifth or sixth largest economy in the world. I mean, it's not an insignificant player. But, it will have taken a permanent hit, and whether these industries of the future, may over time compensate, I really don't know. I mean, if the government has a view that we're going to be generating lots of, new techno startup firms and we're going to be innovative in all this, great. But I'm more of a nuts and bolts person, and I'm not going to worry about the sunlit uplands of the future in 2050. It's more the here and now that concerns me. Right,
but you do know, Alex, as an Aussie who's watched England play at sport, whenever they do win, which is very rare, they've always come back from behind. So maybe that's it. Maybe we actually need to be losing before we have a chance of winning. Perhaps that's the ultimate conclusion. Anyway, it's been great to talk to you, and hopefully we'll get you on again soon. Thanks for your time.
No, you're welcome. Thank you.
And just before we go, my favourite from the papers today, I like this one. Front page of the Metro. It's got a picture of the Queen with the headline, Annus Harrybilus. For this story about Harry and Meghan, it is the front page of almost every newspaper this morning. Plus, the kids going back to school. The Eye says UK's vaccine creator calls for caution as pupils return. I have to say, I do wonder, we are just a few weeks away from Easter. Couldn't we have just waited till after the Easter holidays when more people would have been vaccinated? But we'll see what the impact of that is. It wouldn't be unusual for us to have gone back too early, to ease lockdown too early. Will we ever learn? Only when it's too late. Tomorrow, the impact of COVID on the railways. I'm going to be talking to Sir Michael Holden, Will we be using trains as much when this is all over? And if not, how are railways going to cope with having fewer passengers? Will we see lines close? Should we renationalise them for good? Is it beaching too for the railways? That's on It's the Business tomorrow morning. I'll see you then.
It's the Business with Phil Dobbie. Listen online at its.business or wherever good